Okay, so women were a key part of the Lao Revolution. At the village level, many operated as militias. They kept watch in their villages, passing on information about the enemy, protecting the village. There were grassroots roles to fill, such as the Lao Itzelao Women's Association unit, and older women could volunteer to join the Mothers of Soldiers unit, who looked after various underground agents. They could be their substitute mothers for these men who were often working far from home. Eventually, as the war went on, entire units were composed of women who were engaged in transporting weapons and food to the front, and active combat as well. Many women left home to become teachers, medics, government officers, and undercover agents operating behind enemy lines. And those who stayed home were tasked with increasing food production, becoming literate, and increasing sanitation. There was such a role in the revolution as sanitation fighter, and the term nakop, fighter, was used very loosely in the revolution. Everyone, young or old, male or female, could find an active role in this struggle. In this paper, I want to argue three things. First, that women did have an active role in the Lao Revolution. This was counter to established histories which have not dwelt much on women's role. Second, evidence of women's role in the revolution can be found in a lot of contemporary Lao language writing about the war. I argue that contrary to previous commentary on Lao historiography, this writing is not always boring. Far from it. I do concede that some of it is boring. But the examples I want to talk to you about today are full of vivid descriptions and striking scenes. And third, I argue that this vivid, even gory and slightly sexualized way of talking about the war can be understood as a quite recent development of what I call a Lao Gothic style of writing. Mark Edmondson, writing about American Gothic, has argued that Gothic is very typical of revolutionary moments because the horror is bundled in with glimpses of transcendental hope. This interpretation might help to make sense of the gore, sex, and violence on the one hand, and the visionary clarity on the other that's evident in the text I'll discuss today. I'll begin with this example. Sorry, by the way, this is from a contemporary film, a horror film. So anyway, I have to do both. Okay. I'll begin with this example taken from a book published by the Lao government in 2015, history of the bombing of Xianquang and the women's struggle against the Americans in Xianquang. They say, there's no independence fighters who served in the forest who did not eat rice from the folds of a Lao nationalistic woman's skirt, from her stomach, from her breasts, or from between her legs. Wow, this arresting image is from this book, which I'm holding up here, which is called The Legacy of Logistics Unit 368 and Women's Rocket Artillery Unit 769. This book has no less than 5 prefaces, all from high-ranking military officers or officials, indicating that this book was closely vetted and represents a consensus from the military's perspective on this aspect of the nation's history. In the book, the story of 2 military units, Logistics 368 and Women's Rocket Artillery 469, are detailed. And the quote above, the quote that I just gave you on the previous slide, oops, sorry, I'm not keeping up. So the quote above comes in the context of emphasizing the important role of women in the revolution. So the larger quote states, in every battlefield, in every battle, and at every turn of the nation's history, women were involved doing various duties, if not directly, then indirectly, such as secretly obtaining and passing on information, smuggling food supplies to officers and soldiers in the forest. Now, it's important to know that cutting off food supplies was a tactic frequently used in this 30-year struggle by both sides. So women played an important role in smuggling food past checkpoints and carting it into hard-to-access areas and into combat zones. In many cases, this was on a very small scale. A handful of rice could make all the difference, and it could be tucked into the top folds of a woman's skirt, or tied around her waist, or tucked into her bra. The hope was that by hiding rice in areas considered private or dirty, a woman would be able to hide rice from the men manning the checkpoints in a way that men couldn't. In Laos, it's very common for men, and especially for military men, to be very concerned about their spiritual potency. They commonly carry amulets, sometimes a lot of amulets or tattoos. This is true even today, that guarantee them some kind of protection. But often the potency of these protective devices depends on them keeping them away from women's undergarments and women's lower stratum generally. So when I wash my laundry in Laos and I hang up my skirt and my underpants and stuff, men will not walk under the clothesline. They would rather take the clothesline down and walk around it. This is just ordinary men, but military men are very concerned about charms because they believe that it keeps them impervious to bullets and things. So it's all the more striking then that in this particular publication by the Lao army, in a book that's been so closely vetted and which is so clearly intended to be the definitive history on the topic, that we find this statement quite proudly asserting that the fighters who did win Laos's independence were, without exception, eating foods that would widely have been considered innovating for a soldier. I suggest that this example and others like it in Lao-language official history books and short stories and poems evidences an emerging Lao Gothic style. This is in contrast to earlier, very dry accounts of the history of the war that are available in Laos. The emerging style is Gothic in that it aims to get under the reader's skin, with images likely to shock and to especially shock a Lao readership. Mark Edmondson explains that the Gothic conventions include a hero-villain, a heroine on the run, a terrible place, and uncut fear. The hero-villain is usually evil incarnate, but also revealed to be an interestingly complex character, a role nicely filled by the US and other enemies in this literature. The heroine is usually sublimely innocent, but also alluringly sexualized. And the major point of the plot is often taken as an insistence that the present is haunted by the past. As this book states, mi munan and mi muni, because of those days, that's why we have these days. This is a sort of slogan in Laos, and it conforms to the Gothic conventions that the past haunts every aspect of the present. So this is a brief summary of what the hell I'm talking about in case you don't know about Laos. I'm talking about the 30-year struggle from 1945 to 1975. So at first, this was a struggle against French imperialism. Laos declared independence when France was distracted and weakened by the Second World War, and the Japanese took over control of Laos and encouraged an independence movement, and Prince Petsarat declared independence in 1945. But very soon afterwards, the French returned and tried to reassert control, but this time with the support and backing of the US. And there were terrible massacres and violence, and it forced the Lao independence government underground, and the resistance, many of them fled to Thailand at first, and the independence movement kind of split up under the pressure. Some allied themselves with the returning French and US forces, and others allied themselves with the burgeoning communist movement, and others tried to be neutralist. So then, of course, there were various attempts at Lao neutrality, all of which failed, and Laos suffered from a 30-year civil war, during which period the communist forces controlled the uplands to the east, and the Royal Lao government was concentrated in the cities in the Mekong Valley. This period saw one of the most intensive air wars ever seen in the world. Laos is the most intensively bombed country per capita in the world. The main concentrations were in the Siang Kuang Plains in the north and in the Ho Chi Minh Trail that went through Lao territory in the south. Okay, so why did Lao women join the revolution? So I'm talking about joining the communist side. Recently, the Lao government has begun to publish accounts of the revolutionary years that appear to be based on sessions amongst revolutionary cadre, where people are sharing their memories and recollections from the war. And a lot of these are quite personal. Unfortunately, in these cases, we don't have access to the original testimonies on which these accounts are based, but we do have access to these official versions. So this one's about the Siang Kuang experience, and then there's another one about the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which is quite similar genre. So these often take the format of compilations of stories and anecdotes from the war years, mixed in with more standardized historiography. These contain a number of accounts of gender-based violence. Because there are so few available sources in English that recount gender-based violence during the Lao Civil War, it's worth repeating these here. And I warn you that these scenes are quite disturbing. So this is a trigger warning here for brutal violence and sexual violence. The 2015 publication, this one, in an early section of the book is titled Lao women of various ethnicities in the cause of the national independence struggle against the French imperialists and American imperial interference. It gives a list of examples of the brutalities experienced or witnessed by women as an explanation of why so many women joined the revolution. So their answer, the structure of the book, if you like, answers the question, why did women join the revolution with American and French atrocities, is their answer. Okay. Many of these descriptions of atrocities are very short, but detailed in a sense that they give people's real names, real dates, and real localities. And the few descriptive details that are provided are quite evocative and paint quite a gruesome image. So here are some examples. This is a long, direct quote. During the French seizure of Tarkek on the 21st of the 3rd, 1946, they killed about 2,000 Tarkek residents. Amelie, this is the town I want you to do fieldwork in, Tarkek. Mostly women, some were pregnant, and children. The killings were brutal, pitiless. Bayonets pierced the bellies of pregnant women. Children were pushed into mortars and pounded, pushed into sacks and thrown in a well. Gunfire swept across innocent people, and the corpses were thrown into the Mekong so that the water was the color of blood. Many women saw the suffering caused by the torture of the enemy's tyranny. They saw their children and husbands, their relatives, all the grassroots officers of the revolution, including women, killed brutally and without pity. It was a gory sight. For example, Vientiane province, 1964 to 1974, the enemies killed brutally without pity. Muang Phuang, 79 people in one day. Na Tua village, 52 in one day. Na Dat village, Na Ang village, 26 people killed in one day. Among these was the family of Miss Amkam, mother, father, children, all killed. Miss Amkam was hung from the throat from the branch of a tree and stabbed with a bayonet in the stomach. They pounded chilies and put them in her genital orifices. She was 7 months pregnant at the time. The child came out and died with its mother. They killed her father, mother, husband, and her one other child. In the area of Med Gassi, in the area of Nam Huang, there were 10 people killed. In the area of Tu Lacom, 8 villages burnt completely. 3 families totally killed off, and 100 people killed. In the area of Sai Tani district in Dongbang village, 9 people killed in one day. In that incident, one woman, Miss Tongsa, and grandmother Mun was killed in the middle of the day when she went to tend her buffalo. In Napok village, 17 people were thrown into a mass grave. And in Ta Dindang village, 4 people, brothers and sisters, including one woman, thrown into one grave. In Nahoi village, 7 people, 1 woman, Miss Nyot of Napong village in Longsang area, shot dead up in her house. And grandmother Bun of Nahoi Bang village in Longsang area was hung by the enemies from a house rafter and then slashed with a bayonet, and dried chilies were burnt so that the smoke choked her to death. As for men, another 7, those who were not shot and not slashed with bayonets, had their throats cut and died. So this book goes on and on like this, a sort of list of atrocities, one miniature portrait of brutal war crime after the next. What's striking to me in these brief scenes is how often the materiality of everyday home life plays a role, but in a horribly perverted way. A mortar and pestle is usually used for pounding rice, a woman's sort of daily task. Chilies are usually roasted to make spicy dipping sauce. It's a daily task to attend to one's buffalo. But in these stories, each of these everyday scenes becomes one of torture and atrocity. And the image of mass graves, men's and women's bodies mixed together, too, is a perversion of the care and respect usually shown in mortuary practices in Laos. These stories are designed to chill a Lao audience. A few pages later, sexual crimes are mentioned specifically. Miss Bangun of Nampang village in Hom district, they killed her husband. They took 100 soldiers to rape her for 7 days and 7 nights until she died where she lay. Miss Bun of Wang Luang village, Longsan area, likewise. More than 20 enemy soldiers raped her until she died right there. And then they ordered her husband to have intercourse with her corpse. The husband did not do it, so they killed him beside her. Miss C and her husband, Mr. Da of Na Pong village in Longsan area, were killed. Her youngest child didn't know its mother was dead, and it crawled over to drink its mother's milk, where she lay, soaked in a pool of blood. Miss Pon of Nanyang village in Nai Song Tong village district was ordered by enemies to marry one of them, and she refused because she was faithful to her husband in the forest. The enemies took a hoe and chopped up her head. And then there was the bombing. 374 people were killed in just one incident. when a bomb entered Pew Cave in Kham District, Sian Kuang Province, on the 24th of November, 1968. Mostly the dead were children, women, and the elderly. This book goes on to state that the bombing caused immense suffering, including massive displacements as people fled to Vietnam, the forest, or Vientiane. And it says twice that anyone who saw these scenes would never forget it. It explains that women who witnessed scenes like this were angry and bitter, so that when they had the chance to build a revolutionary struggle, they eagerly joined it, this is a quote, and made a contribution that was just as admirable as the contribution made by men. So it's quite, as I mentioned before, it's clear that these traumatic scenes are provided in this book as a foil for the later chapters, which describe the victorious struggle when women banded together in units and fought back. This story shows how women rose up to support the war effort, and in particular focuses on two women's only military units. So by contrast, in the more detailed biographies that I've read of specific female revolutionaries, it's clear that in fact, women usually join the revolution not out of choice, but because of their particular life circumstances. So without going into too much detail, I'd say that the more common pattern was for women to join when they were very young, probably 11, 12 years old. And usually it was because their fathers were already involved in the revolution and they followed their family in. So it wasn't really like they were just sitting around looking at atrocities and then thinking, oh, I want to go and fight. It was more like atrocities were part of the background context of these girls' lives. They felt that if they didn't join the revolution, then they might be abducted to marry somebody in the royal government or raped, and the revolution offered a sort of structure of safety for young girls. So even among women who did join the revolution, in an official sense, many who did not join the revolution in an official sense, many still carried out important work to support the revolution on the home front. So I've moved on to the roles of women in the Lao Revolution. So in that book about the Ho Chi Minh Trail that I mentioned to you before, a young Alak family moved close to a Vietnamese base in present-day Saigon province to avoid the fighting. So this is an example of somebody who wasn't active in the revolution, but who helped on the home front. So this particular woman, her husband had gone off to fight and she was pregnant and she gave birth, and then she learned that he was dead. And she was staying near a Vietnamese base. And she says, this is an oral history recorded in the Ho Chi Minh Trail book. And she says when the child was about 6 months old, the military base head approached her to ask if she would consider letting a very ill soldier suckle from her breasts. She and her family agreed, and there's a scene quite vividly described. I'll read it to you. Not long afterwards, 2 Vietnamese soldiers arrived carrying a third between them. His face and his eyes were the yellow of a ripe banana. He was thin, his eyes did not want to open, and wherever you placed his hand, there it stayed. The 2 soldiers propped him up against the wall of the house. Mayhem handed her baby to her sister and opened her shirt. She took her nipple and put it in his mouth for him to suck, and everyone sitting with them encouraged him to suck in order that he might live. He drank both breasts until both breasts were shrunken, and then his fellows carried him back to the base. He drank every day from her breasts directly for a month, and after that, they say he was cured, and Mayhem's own baby died. But she remarried again and had 12 more births, of which 3 grew to adulthood. After 1975, she and the other ethnic Alak villagers returned to their traditional territories. And then one day she received a letter from Vietnam. It was from that man who had suckled from her and who was expressing his thanks and recognition of her virtue in saving his life. Now, to be clear, this is a massive breach of everyday norms in Laos. It's not like in Laos it's cool to like suckle on a grown woman's breast. Like for both the woman and the man, this is a serious breach of everyday mores. It represents a sacrifice on both of their parts, and one that seemed to haunt them years later. Another vivid description, this one drawn from a poem called Sacrificing Perspiration for the Nation. So this is a poem about describing a woman who had been blind since she was 12, and she grew up in a rural village, sort of very much kept to the home. She couldn't go out to the fields, but she could do domestic tasks. And when the revolution came, it goes into quite some detail about how everybody in the liberated zones had to contribute rice, but they didn't want just the rice, they wanted it pounded. And in those days, pounding was a physical manual job. So this blind woman agreed to pound the rice, not only for her contribution, but for anybody who came asked her to pound it for them because they were busy working the fields or whatever. And the poet sort of lyrically describes the process of pounding rice, how you have to tie a child or a rock to your back to give you the weight you need to push the giant lever down with your body weight to lift up the pestle and then let it crash down on the rice. She, with her bare foot, shirt drenched in sweat, hair everywhere, morning and night, this blind woman pounded so much rice for the front that her foot, the poet says, was like a rubber tire. And when she stepped on the thorn bent. The poet points out that this woman never received anything for her sacrifices after the war. She never got a pension. She never got a fancy government job. But she always said that she'd been glad to help the war effort. The poet argues in quite a lengthy sort of social commentary style that this blind woman's sacrifice of perspiration for the nation should be taken as an inspiration today to unite people, allow people to make sacrifices, not sacrifices in the style of thinking about what they'll get in return, but a true sacrifice, thinking only of what they can contribute. It was not at all uncommon for children to join the revolution. In this book, this 2015 book I've been telling you about, for instance, they have a number of stories of individual women, 23 individual women. And of those, the age range is joining the revolution when they're 11 years old up to 21. It appears that very young women, teenagers or girls on the cusp of becoming teenagers, were the specific targets for recruitment into the movement. So typically the first step was to draft the girl into a village level group called the Gong Yuana Li, the Young Women's Unit. So these are, the authors of this book describe Gong Yuana Li as an arts troupe. The literal translation is Young Women's Unit, but if you say Gong Yuana Li, people immediately think of this sort of thing. Girls and young women were taught songs and dances that they then performed in grassroots areas for the purposes of raising nationalistic spirit. These were not traditional songs, but they had titles like Advance, Lao Women, Struggle, and Laos Must Be Owned by Lao. The authors explained that these songs illustrated the role of women and the true substance of the revolution and denounced the evils of enemy aggressors. They were able to pull and suck in the masses of all kinds more deeply into the revolution. And Ratanavong, a minister of culture, has written extensively about this new style of music that emerged during the war. He said, war might be won in politics, but cannot be won in culture. To win completely is to win in culture. So this is a more recent one. I'll get to that one in a second. So Gong Yuana Li troops also embroidered handkerchiefs and repaired soldiers' uniforms and wrote sort of well wishes to soldiers to boost morale on the front. Some of the most talented performers at a village level will continue in arts troupes and sort of become professional. And so there were revolutionaries whose entire careers were singing and dancing. And they made sort of movies in China after the revolution with a lot of these sort of stars. However, most girls would only be part of a Gong Yuana Li for a little while their future roles were determined. So in the biographies that I've read, one of them used the revolution to fulfill a lifelong dream of becoming a medic. Another one was assigned to propaganda and mobilization. So this particular girl recounts how when she was 13 years old, her job was to walk up to people who were out working in their fields when they're out of the village and talk to them about the revolution. It would have been much too dangerous for her to enter the village. So propaganda and mobilization work appears to be a very common pathway for female revolutionaries. This is also a common, depiction of women in creative literature, short stories based in the war era. So there's another, and they kind of remind me, if you've ever read of Maxim Gorky's Mother, where they have these Soviet sort of women going out and talking to the peasants, very much in that style. And the other major thing that women did was, as I said, carting rice. This seemed to begin quite spontaneously when women wanted to bring food to their male relatives working on the front. But eventually it inspired the Lao People's Revolutionary Army to formalize entire units of transport composed of women. So the most famous one is Gong Hoi Lam Liang Bear Carp, which is like the unit of 100 who carry and transport 368. So this was established in 1968. So People who were in this unit remember carrying loads of up to 75 or even 100 kilos of rice at a time. And this unit quickly filled, so that a second unit was established in 1969. But in this second unit, they also gave them the task of rocket artillery. So these women were carrying mortars. Sorry, which one can you see? Sorry, I've been, oh, there's the gong you want to leave. Sorry, I've been going on the wrong screen. So these women were carrying anti-aircraft rockets and setting them up, and they could fight, and also artillery for shelling people in trenches. So all of these units, eventually there were 5 all-female units based in Xian Kuang. So this so this is the origin of the saying still popular in Laos, the beautiful and brave women of Xian Kuang. And so this is a clip from a contemporary music video of a song which carries that name, which is quite a popular song. So it's important to note that these military units, even when they were like, the clip I have here is, it says Sip Song Millibet, which is like 12mm gun. They're talking about the kind of guns that they would carry around. But you can see as well, it's still quite, it's got the Gong Yuan Ali dancing, singing aspect to it, and the emphasis on how beautiful they are, as well as how militarily adroit they are. The women working in the transport and logistics units were all trained in song and dance. So like after carrying 100 kilos of rice across the mountains, they'd often put on a show for the troops after delivering food. Some of these units were also involved in active combat, of course. So the legacy story points out the fact that it was women specifically who were firing the rockets made them all the more dangerous in the eyes of the enemy. The book recounts how in one battle on the Xiangkuang Plains in 1972, the enemy was dug into a mountain, and the usual male-only battle units couldn't make them budge. So on the third day, the Women's Artillery Unit 769 was called in. And when the enemy heard that the women were coming, the book says it made them shiver with the deepest fear, because they believe that when women turn a gun against anyone, even if that person has charms to protect themselves, no matter how powerful, the charms will not be able to protect them from bullets. And therefore, a number of soldiers deserted and the enemies were routed. So this is my conclusion now. Edmondson explains that Gothic was the literature of revolution, specifically the revolution in France, maybe you can tell us more about it, Lorraine, that dominated the European consciousness in the last decade of the 18th century. Lao Gothic too is the literature, I say, of a revolution. Edmondson suggests that Gothic arose as an art form in the 18th century because it expressed the anxieties unleashed by the massive social changes of the time. Hope and faith were put in new freedoms, but mixed in with fear and nostalgia. Legacy of the Women's Rocket Unit, this book, notes that there was something specific about women as women that was mobilized during the war. In a paragraph of thinly veiled sexual innuendo, Legacy states that female revolutionaries used, and I quote, specific characteristics of a female body and intelligence, such as using sung poetry, singing, music, dance, and the beauty of their bodily forms to entertain the officers and fighters of the ordinary people. At the same time, they held high the ideology and aspirations of the struggle, raising the level of patriotism, solidarity, mutual aid, and brave resolution to never surrender. Towards the enemy, sometimes women smiled and spoke sweetly, and acted in such a way so that they could ask for understanding and reprieves from the oppression, or trick the enemies so they would totally believe their ruse. They used hair buns and bras to hide letters from the leadership. In their water buckets, resin buckets, in the folds of their skirts, in their baby slings, they hid food supplies for grassroots officers. They used their skirts, their bedrooms, their embraces as hiding places and cover for grassroots officers, patriotic soldiers, and even going so far as using their own bodies for enemies to caress, or as a shield to take bullets in exchange for the safety of their children, their husband, or officers and relatives. They used their decisive bravery, sometimes swearing obscenities, cursing, denouncing the enemy to make them shocked and afraid. They used their soft, clear, and beautiful fingers to pull the trigger and kill the enemy and shoot down completely so many American air bandits. This statement, I argue, is high Gothic. The innocent heroine finally pulls the trigger on the villain hero. I suggest this passage, together with the rest of the book and the other literature I've discussed, tells us 4 important things about the Lao Revolution. First, these underline the stance the revolutionaries took against traditions that they deemed to stand in the way of revolution. The revolution was from the very beginning a cultural revolution, not simply a military struggle. Where necessary, old practices such as belief in the efficacy of charms and niceties would be discarded in the name of victory. Second, it illustrates some of the sacrifices fighting men and women alike were prepared to make in the name of revolution, including sacrifices of quite deeply held attitudes towards their own bodies. Often the sacrifices people made were gender-specific sorts of sacrifices. Third, these examples make clear the contributions women made to the revolutionary struggle. And finally, these emphasize that women participated in the struggle very much as women, not as proxy men. The quotation above and stories from the war more generally underline how women, often as sexualized beings, were a critical part of the Lao Revolution. So that's me done.